Many people are still working. They still wake up early, commute, pay bills, and maintain routines that, on the surface, may not look very different from before. Employment has not disappeared from their lives. Income is still coming in. Daily life continues moving forward. And yet, something feels heavier. Routine spending now requires more attention. Ordinary purchases feel larger than they used to. Small financial mistakes feel harder to absorb. A full tank of gas, a grocery run, a delivery fee, a week of driving individually. None of these expenses necessarily look catastrophic. But together, they create a different financial experience than many households were living with just a few years earlier. The pressure is not always dramatic enough to create panic. In many cases, that is exactly why it becomes difficult to explain. People are still functioning normally, but normal life itself has become more expensive to maintain. Fuel prices illustrate this shift clearly. During 2026, gasoline prices climbed to around $4.18 per gallon, while diesel approached approximately $5.65. Earlier in the year, those increases were highly visible because they moved rapidly. Gasoline rose roughly 40% over earlier levels, while diesel climbed close to 50% from prices near the mid-$3 range. Consumers reacted immediately because the increases were sudden and obvious, but the deeper effect began after the sharpest increases slowed down. The problem was no longer only that prices had risen. The problem was that they stayed elevated long enough to spread through the rest of the economy. Diesel continued affecting transportation costs across a system where approximately 75% of goods move by truck. Freight costs remained elevated. Goods transported under higher fuel expenses continued moving through supply chains and into stores. Everyday spending began carrying the weight of those earlier increases long after the initial shock had faded from headlines. This changed the emotional experience of the economy. At first, rising prices feel temporary. Consumers expect conditions to stabilize once disruptions ease. But when elevated costs continue month after month, households stop reacting to the spike itself and begin adjusting to the possibility that expensive has become normal. That adjustment often happens quietly. People do not necessarily stop working or dramatically change their lives. Instead, financial flexibility begins shrinking slowly around routine decisions. Driving becomes more intentional, spending becomes more calculated. Optional purchases receive more scrutiny. The margin for error becomes smaller, even when income itself has not disappeared. This is an important distinction because financial pressure does not always arrive through unemployment or sudden collapse. Sometimes it develops through accumulation. Costs rise across multiple areas of daily life and remain elevated long enough that ordinary routines begin, requiring more effort to maintain. Over time, the pressure becomes less about shock and more about fatigue. The earlier phase of rising fuel prices produced frustration because the movement was visible and immediate. The current phase produces something quieter. Consumers continue functioning within the economy, but with more caution behind routine choices. Budgets require more management. Everyday spending carries more psychological weight. The economy feels tighter, even when life outwardly appears stable. Data from this period reflects that pressure. Approximately 55% of Americans reported fuel costs affecting their finances, while around 21% described the impact as severe. Those figures suggest that elevated transportation and energy costs are not isolated inconveniences. They are shaping how households experience ordinary life, and that experience often creates a feeling many people struggle to describe clearly. The paycheck may still exist, the job may still exist, but the financial comfort surrounding those things begins eroding slowly as elevated costs remain embedded throughout the system. The same income no longer creates the same flexibility it once did. That is where this economic story begins. Not with collapse, not with panic, but with a quieter reality of working households slowly realizing that ordinary life feels financially heavier than it used to. The financial pressure many households are experiencing now did not emerge from a single expense. It developed through a chain of costs that spread gradually through transportation, supply systems, and routine spending. What began as a fuel increase eventually became part of the broader cost structure surrounding everyday life. The first stage was the rapid rise in fuel prices during early 2026. Gasoline climbed to around $4.18 per gallon after increasing roughly 40% over earlier levels. Diesel moved even more sharply, rising from prices near the mid-$3 range to approximately $5.65 per gallon, an increase close to 50%. At first, these changes felt concentrated at the pump. Consumers noticed the immediate difference when filling their vehicles, and businesses faced rapidly increasing fuel expenses across transportation networks. But fuel is not only a direct consumer cost, it is also a foundational operating expense across large parts of the economy. That became especially important with diesel. Approximately 75% of goods in the United States are moved by truck, and those trucks rely heavily on diesel fuel. When diesel prices rise sharply, transportation costs increase across freight systems responsible for moving groceries, retail inventory, household products, deliveries, and industrial supplies throughout the country. As diesel approached $5.65 per gallon, transportation companies began facing significantly higher operating expenses. Reports from the period indicated that approximately 91% of carriers were affected by elevated fuel costs. Freight movement became more expensive because fuel is one of the largest ongoing expenses inside trucking operations. Those higher transportation costs did not remain isolated within logistics companies. They spread outward through supply chains. Businesses receiving shipments faced higher delivery expenses. Retailers adjusted pricing to reflect increased transportation costs. Goods arriving at warehouses and store shelves carried the added expense of moving through a more expensive freight system. Over time, the effects appeared across routine consumer spending. This is one reason the financial pressure feels broader than gasoline alone. Fuel prices influence far more than commuting costs. They affect the movement of nearly everything households purchase regularly. Groceries, deliveries, retail products, and everyday goods all depend on transportation systems that became more expensive during the fuel spike. The process unfolded gradually but consistently. At first, households mainly noticed higher gasoline expenses. But as transportation costs spread through the economy, the effect became harder to isolate because it appeared across multiple categories simultaneously. Routine life began costing more in several places at once rather than through one dramatic expense alone. This created a different kind of pressure. Large financial shocks are easy to recognize because they interrupt spending suddenly. Persistent cost increases operate differently. They spread slowly across ordinary expenses until the cumulative effect begins changing how households experience daily life. The inventory system contributed to this process as well. Goods currently sold during this period were often produced, transported, or distributed when fuel costs were already elevated. Even after the fastest phase of price increases slowed, those earlier transportation expenses remained embedded inside supply chains. Products moving through warehouses and retail systems continued reflecting the cost structure created during the fuel spike. That lag effect matters because it explains why prices often remain elevated even after fuel headlines become less dramatic. The earlier increase had already moved through the economy. Freight contracts, operating expenses, and retail pricing had already adjusted to the higher transportation environment. Once those changes became embedded, the broader cost structure did not automatically reverse when price acceleration slowed down. At the same time, supply flexibility remained limited. Refinery disruptions earlier in the year removed more than 800,000 barrels per day from supply, while gasoline inventories declined by approximately 6.08 million barrels within a single week. Refinery utilization remained near 90 to 95% capacity, leaving limited room to rapidly expand production and relieve pressure throughout the fuel system. As long as supply remained constrained relative to demand, fuel prices stayed elevated enough to continue influencing transportation and goods across the economy. For households, the result was not necessarily a sudden financial collapse. Instead, it was a steady increase in the cost of maintaining ordinary life. Driving became more expensive. Groceries absorbed higher transportation costs. Deliveries reflected elevated freight expenses. Routine spending required more budgeting attention because multiple categories were affected simultaneously. Over time, these pressures began changing the emotional experience of spending itself. The issue was no longer simply that one category had become more expensive. The issue was that higher costs appeared repeatedly across ordinary routines. A tank of gas cost more. A grocery trip cost more. Deliveries cost more. Everyday financial flexibility slowly became narrower because elevated costs remained present in multiple areas at once. This is how the pressure spread through daily life, not through one dramatic moment, but through a chain reaction that carried higher fuel and transportation costs into the ordinary structure of household spending. As the most rapid phase of fuel increases began slowing down, many households expected some level of relief to follow. The earlier spike had felt intense and temporary, shaped by supply disruptions, declining inventories, and rapidly rising transportation costs. Under normal expectations, once the disruption eased, prices would begin moving back toward earlier levels and financial pressure would gradually fade. But that is not what happened. The pace of increase slowed, yet the overall cost structure remained elevated. Gasoline stayed near approximately $4.18 per gallon. Diesel remained around $5.65. Transportation costs continued operating above earlier norms, and everyday spending still reflected the effects of those earlier increases. This created a different economic experience than many consumers expected. The issue was no longer rapid inflation alone. The issue became persistence. One reason relief never fully arrived is that the earlier increases had already moved through the system before conditions began stabilizing. Goods transported during the fuel spike continued moving through warehouses, supply chains, and retail networks long afterward. Their pricing reflected the higher transportation costs under which they were moved. That delay is important because prices do not reset instantly once fuel markets stabilize. A grocery item sitting on a shelf may reflect transportation expenses from weeks or months earlier. Deliveries already scheduled under higher freight costs continue entering retail systems. Businesses continue operating under contracts and pricing structures established during the period of elevated fuel expenses. As a result, consumers continue paying prices shaped by earlier conditions even after the most visible stage of the fuel spike is passed. This lag effect became one of the defining characteristics of the broader economic environment during 2026. The same dynamic appeared inside business operations themselves. When fuel and transportation costs rose sharply, companies adjusted pricing to maintain operational stability. Freight expenses increased, distribution costs increased. Businesses adapted to those higher operating conditions by embedding them into pricing decisions across multiple categories. Once those adjustments were made, they did not automatically reverse when the pace of inflation slowed. Businesses continued operating inside the higher cost structure that had already formed. If fuel remained elevated relative to earlier levels, transportation remained elevated as well. As long as those costs persisted, the incentive to substantially reduce pricing remained limited. This created an environment where prices stopped accelerating rapidly but also failed to return to previous levels. That distinction shaped how households experienced the economy. Consumers often associate relief with prices falling, but a slower rate of increase is not the same thing as affordability returning. If gasoline remains above $4 per gallon and diesel remains above $5, routine life continues costing more than before even without another major spike. This is one reason the emotional experience of the economy changed from frustration to fatigue. During the earlier phase, rising prices produced immediate reactions because movement was visible week by week. Later, consumers faced something more difficult psychologically: elevated costs without visible improvement. Prices were no longer exploding upward, yet the financial pressure continued month after month. That persistence changes expectations. At first, households tend to assume high prices are temporary disruptions. But when elevated costs continue without meaningful reversal, consumers begin adjusting behavior around the possibility that relief may not arrive quickly. The pressure becomes less dramatic but more permanent feeling. Supply conditions reinforced this environment as well. Refinery utilization remained near 90 to 95% capacity, limiting the system's ability to rapidly increase production and significantly lower fuel costs. Earlier disruptions had already tightened supply conditions enough that flexibility remained limited even after the most visible phase of instability eased. Diesel remained especially important because its influence extended throughout transportation networks. Approximately 75% of goods continued moving through trucking systems affected by elevated fuel costs. As long as diesel remained historically high, transportation expenses continued shaping retail pricing and household spending. This meant that even when fuel prices appeared more stable in headlines, the broader economy continued carrying the cost structure created during the earlier spike. For consumers, the result was an unusual form of economic pressure. The visible emergency phase had passed, but ordinary life still felt more expensive than before. Households continued working, earning income, and maintaining routines, yet financial flexibility remained narrower. Everyday expenses continued absorbing larger portions of monthly budgets because elevated costs had spread across multiple categories simultaneously. That ongoing pressure gradually changes how people think about spending. Consumers become more cautious, not necessarily because conditions are collapsing, but because higher costs remain unresolved for too long. Over time, households stop waiting for immediate normalization and begin adapting to the assumption that routine expenses may simply remain higher than before. This is the stage where relief becomes psychologically complicated. The absence of new shocks creates the appearance of stability, but stability at a higher price level still produces pressure. Consumers no longer react emotionally to every movement in fuel prices because the adjustment has already occurred. Instead, they experience the cumulative weight of elevated costs repeated across ordinary routines. This repetition matters more than any individual purchase. A single expensive grocery trip may feel manageable, a single tank of gas may not seem catastrophic. But when elevated costs continue appearing across fuel, deliveries, transportation, and household spending month after month, the broader financial effect becomes difficult to ignore. That is why relief never fully arrived. The economy did not return to its earlier cost structure once the sharpest phase of price increases slowed down. The earlier increases had already spread too deeply into transportation systems, supply chains, and household budgets. Consumers were no longer reacting to a temporary spike. They were learning how to operate inside a more expensive version of ordinary life. One of the most important effects of persistent higher costs is that financial pressure often appears long before households reach any visible breaking point. The change usually begins somewhere quieter, not with collapse, but with shrinking flexibility. That process can be difficult to recognize at first because life outwardly continues functioning. People still work, bills still get paid, daily routines continue moving forward. From the outside, the situation may appear stable, but underneath that stability, the margin around ordinary life begins narrowing. This is where many households started feeling the deeper effects of elevated costs during 2026. Fuel prices remained significantly above earlier levels. Transportation expenses stayed elevated. Groceries and routine goods continued reflecting the cost structure created during the earlier fuel spike. Over time, those pressures accumulated across multiple areas of spending simultaneously. The result was not necessarily immediate financial crisis. Instead, it was a gradual reduction in breathing room. That reduction changes how people experience money. The same paycheck may still arrive each month, yet it no longer creates the same level of comfort or flexibility it once did. More income becomes committed to routine expenses before households have the opportunity to make discretionary decisions. Costs that once felt manageable begin requiring more planning because there is less remaining margin after necessities are covered. This is why many people describe feeling financially weaker even while continuing to work. The issue is not always disappearing income. Often, it is that elevated costs consume larger portions of existing income over time. Fuel illustrates this clearly because its effects extend beyond direct driving expenses. Gasoline around $4.18 per gallon and diesel near $5.65 continue influencing transportation, commuting, deliveries, and the broader cost of goods moving throughout the economy. Since approximately 75% of goods are transported by truck, elevated diesel prices remain embedded across everyday purchases. As those costs persist, households begin adjusting behavior around the reality that routine life now requires more financial management than before. The first thing that often disappears is flexibility itself. Optional spending becomes more difficult to justify. Small conveniences receive more scrutiny. Everyday decisions begin involving more calculation because there is less room to absorb unnecessary expenses without consequence. This process develops gradually. Driving becomes more intentional. Errands are combined together more often. Deliveries that once felt routine may feel less necessary. Consumers continue participating in ordinary life, but with more attention directed toward controlling costs wherever possible. These are not dramatic reactions. That is precisely why they matter. Economic stress is often easier to recognize when it appears suddenly through unemployment or financial panic. But persistent elevated costs create a different kind of pressure. Households adapt quietly, reducing flexibility piece by piece rather than reacting through visible collapse. The emotional effect of this process becomes significant over time. Earlier in the year, consumers reacted to the rapid increase in prices themselves. Later, the experience shifted towards something more exhausting, maintaining ordinary life inside a system where expenses remained elevated without meaningful relief. That ongoing pressure changes how spending feels psychologically. Routine purchases begin carrying more weight because they are repeated constantly. A grocery bill may not appear extreme individually. Fuel expenses may still seem manageable on their own, but repeated together week after week, those costs slowly reduce the sense of financial ease surrounding everyday life. This creates what can be described as shrinking flexibility. The ability to absorb unexpected expenses becomes weaker. The ability to spend casually becomes more limited. Financial decisions become more structured because households recognize that elevated costs are no longer temporary disruptions but continuing conditions. Importantly, this does not necessarily mean households feel poor in an absolute sense. The experience is often more subtle than that. Many people continue working full-time. They continue paying mortgages, utilities, groceries, and transportation costs. But the emotional experience surrounding those routines changes because maintaining them requires more effort than before. That effort becomes mentally exhausting over time. Pressure that lasts for weeks often feels temporary. Pressure that lasts for months begins changing expectations. Consumers stop waiting for immediate normalization and start reorganizing behavior around the assumption that elevated costs may continue indefinitely. This transition is psychologically important because it changes how people think about ordinary life itself. Spending becomes less spontaneous. Financial decisions become more defensive. Households begin protecting flexibility wherever they can because there is less remaining margin available once necessities are covered. The adaptation often happens quietly enough that consumers themselves may not fully recognize how much their behavior has changed. A few fewer unnecessary purchases, more attention paid to fuel usage, more caution surrounding routine expenses. Individually, these adjustments appear small. Collectively, they reflect a broader economic shift. This is the stage where elevated costs stop feeling temporary and begin reshaping behavior. The earlier fuel spike created visible shock. The shrinking flexibility effect creates something different. It creates an economy where ordinary households continue functioning but with increasingly narrower financial margins, supporting routine life. That narrowing changes not only spending patterns, but the emotional relationship people have with money itself. And once flexibility begins disappearing across millions of households simultaneously, the economy enters a much deeper stage of adjustment than a temporary price spike alone could create. The longer elevated costs remain in place, the more the economic experience begins changing from frustration into fatigue. That transition is important because fatigue affects people differently than sudden financial shocks do. A rapid increase in prices creates immediate reactions. Persistent pressure creates exhaustion. Earlier in 2026, the economy felt unstable because prices were moving quickly. Gasoline rose sharply toward approximately $4.18 per gallon. Diesel climbed near $5.65 after increasing close to 50% from earlier levels near the mid-$3 range. Supply disruptions removed more than 800,000 barrels per day from the system. Inventories declined, and transportation costs spread rapidly through supply chains. Consumers reacted strongly because the movement was visible and immediate. Shock produces urgency. People notice abrupt changes quickly because those changes interrupt expectations all at once. The early phase of rising fuel costs created exactly that environment. Households experienced the pressure directly at the pump, and businesses rapidly adjusted transportation and freight pricing in response. But over time, the emotional experience of the economy began changing. Prices stopped accelerating at the same speed, yet the pressure itself remained. Gasoline stayed elevated. Diesel stayed elevated. Transportation costs remained embedded throughout goods and services. Everyday life continued costing more than before, even without another dramatic spike. That persistence created something psychologically heavier than the initial shock. Fatigue develops when pressure continues without meaningful relief. The earlier phase created visible frustration because consumers believed conditions might normalize quickly once disruptions eased. But as elevated costs remained month after month, households gradually stopped reacting to individual price increases and began adjusting to the broader reality of a more expensive system. That adjustment changes how people experience ordinary life. The issue is no longer simply that fuel became expensive. The issue is that multiple routine expenses remain elevated simultaneously for long periods of time. Groceries cost more. Transportation costs more. Deliveries cost more. Daily financial management requires more attention because elevated expenses continue appearing repeatedly across ordinary routines. Over time, the repetition itself becomes exhausting. This kind of economic fatigue does not necessarily create dramatic public reactions. In many ways, it produces the opposite. Consumers become quieter. Spending becomes more cautious. Financial decisions become more structured. Households adapt behavior gradually because sustained pressure leaves less room for spontaneity and flexibility. That process often appears emotionally different from traditional financial crises. There may be no immediate panic. Employment may continue. Daily life still functions. But underneath that outward stability, many households begin carrying a constant awareness of costs that did not exist before. Routine spending requires more thought. Small expenses feel heavier because they occur inside an environment where financial margins have already narrowed. This is one reason why economic fatigue can become difficult to measure directly while still affecting large numbers of people. The pressure spreads slowly through repetition rather than through dramatic moments. Consumers continue working and participating in the economy, but with more caution behind ordinary decisions. The emotional tone shifts from reacting to crisis toward managing constant pressure. That distinction matters because fatigue changes expectations over time. Shock often feels temporary. Fatigue feels indefinite. When elevated costs continue long enough, households stop expecting immediate normalization. Instead, they begin organizing routines around the assumption that the pressure may continue for much longer than originally expected. This changes how people approach spending, planning, and financial security itself. The system conditions reinforce that feeling. Refinery utilization remaining near 90 to 95% limits supply flexibility. Diesel continues influencing transportation systems that move approximately 75% of goods across the country. Earlier transportation increases remain embedded inside retail pricing because goods already moved under higher freight costs continue flowing through supply chains. As long as those conditions remain unresolved, consumers continue operating inside the higher cost structure created earlier in the year. This creates an important psychological effect. The economy no longer feels unstable in the same way it did during the initial fuel spike. Instead, it feels persistently heavy. Consumers adapt behavior not because they are reacting emotionally to new increases, but because the existing cost structure continuously reduces financial breathing room. The difference between those two experiences is significant. Shock interrupts routines suddenly. Fatigue slowly reshapes routines over time. One creates visible reaction. The other creates quieter behavioral adjustment. Households begin protecting flexibility wherever possible because elevated costs continue absorbing larger portions of income. Optional spending becomes more selective. Driving becomes more intentional. Everyday financial management becomes more constant because the pressure never fully disappears. This is where the emotional economy begins diverging from traditional economic indicators. On the surface, daily life may appear relatively stable. People continue working, commuting, shopping, and paying bills. Yet the emotional experience surrounding those routines feels increasingly constrained because maintaining ordinary life requires more effort than before. That effort accumulates. Financial fatigue rarely arrives through one catastrophic moment. It develops through repetition, the same elevated costs appearing month after month, the same reduced flexibility surrounding routine spending, the same sense that ordinary life has become more expensive to maintain without equivalent relief arriving afterward. And over time, that persistence changes not only spending behavior, but the emotional relationship households have with the economy itself. The current reality is not defined by sudden economic collapse or dramatic disruption. It is defined by persistence. The most rapid phase of fuel increases may have slowed, but the broader pressure created during that period continues shaping everyday life across the country. Gasoline remains elevated near approximately $4.18 per gallon. Diesel remains around $5.65. Transportation costs continue reflecting those levels, and supply flexibility remains limited after refinery disruptions earlier in the year removed more than 800,000 barrels per day from the system. Refinery utilization continuing near 90 to 95% means the fuel system still operates with relatively limited excess capacity. These conditions matter because they continue influencing far more than direct fuel purchases. Approximately 75% of goods still move by truck. Those transportation systems continue operating under elevated diesel costs. Earlier increases in freight expenses remain embedded throughout supply chains, retail pricing, and household spending. Even after the most visible stage of the fuel spike passed, the broader cost structure created during that period remained in place. For households, this means ordinary life continues costing more than before. The pressure is no longer concentrated inside one category. It spreads across routine spending in ways that gradually reduce financial flexibility over time. Fuel, groceries, deliveries, transportation, and other everyday expenses continue absorbing larger portions of monthly income. The issue is not necessarily that income disappeared. The issue is that elevated costs remain unresolved long enough to reshape how households manage ordinary life. That reshaping often happens quietly. People continue working, daily routines continue functioning. But behind those routines, spending becomes more cautious and more structured. Financial decisions require more calculation because the margin surrounding ordinary life has become narrower than before. This is one of the defining characteristics of the current stage of the economy. The earlier phase was driven by visible shock. The current phase is defined by adaptation. Consumers are no longer reacting primarily to sudden increases in prices. They are adjusting behavior around the reality that elevated costs may remain part of ordinary life for longer than expected. That adjustment changes the emotional experience of the economy. The pressure no longer feels temporary, it feels ongoing. Consumers stop waiting for quick normalization and begin reorganizing routines around the assumption that higher costs are now part of the system itself. Over time, that persistence creates economic fatigue rather than panic. This distinction matters because fatigue often becomes economically significant before traditional signs of crisis appear. Major economic changes do not always arrive through collapse. Sometimes they emerge gradually through shrinking flexibility, cautious spending, and households quietly adapting to sustained pressure. The current environment reflects exactly that kind of transition. Fuel prices are no longer accelerating rapidly, yet ordinary life still feels financially heavier than before. Elevated transportation costs continue shaping household budgets. Routine spending requires more attention. The emotional comfort once surrounding ordinary financial decisions becomes weaker because higher costs remain present across multiple categories simultaneously. For many households, this creates the feeling that money no longer stretches the same way it once did. That feeling is not necessarily driven by one dramatic expense. It develops through repetition. A grocery bill that remains elevated. A tank of gas that still costs more than expected. Deliveries and routine purchases continuing to reflect higher transportation expenses month after month. Over time, those repeated pressures change how people think about spending, movement, and financial security itself. This is the deeper reality underneath the current economic environment. The story is no longer only about fuel prices. It is about what happens when elevated costs remain in place long enough to alter routines, expectations, and the emotional relationship households have with money. Consumers continue functioning within the economy, but often with more caution, less flexibility, and more fatigue than before. And that may be the most important shift of all. Not a sudden collapse, not a dramatic panic, but a quieter transition where ordinary life gradually becomes more expensive to maintain, and households slowly adapt to carrying that pressure every day.